British were god-awful because they have the worst imperial mentality of any country in the world. So Britain industrialized first, roughly 1700, and then the difference of economic might was translated into geopolitical imperial power, and then went overseas and kicked the shit out of the rest of the world, basically. It completely colonized Indian subcontinent. It invaded China in 1839. Britain went in and took over much of Africa and took over much of America, of course, the
Also Cyprus.
And the first rule of empire is you extract from your colonies, you take the resources away, you keep them poor, and you keep them uneducated also. All that empire, they didn't want to give schools, they didn't want to educate anybody. So literacy rates in 1950, 5%. In some countries, with 4 or 5 people with a high school education out of millions. And since education is the main route to economic development, colonies everywhere just fell farther and farther behind. So as technology had improved in Europe, it had not really improved in the colonies. There it was plantations and mining, extracting resources, not building industry based on improved skills and education. And so the gap of power widened from 1800 to 1950. We call it the era of economic divergence. So the world divided between the so-called developed and developing countries. So it was a very, very brutal period up through the middle of the 20th century. Then Europe had 2 devastating civil wars, basically, World War I and World War II, 2 bloodbaths with the Great Depression in between. But after World War II, what had been that age of divergence gradually turned into an age of convergence. And by 1945, Europe was exhausted. The deaths and destruction were so vast that every energy was towards rebuilding rather than colonies. So one by one, the colonies became independent, free from the yoke of Britain, some because independence was granted and others because they fought wars of liberation. But between 1945, basically, and the 1970s, most of the European empires vanished. And one very important thing happened when that occurred. You now had independent nations, and just about the first thing that they did was introduce mass literacy and mass education. Suddenly, those economies were able to start developing. They were able to do things that their imperial masters had prevented them from doing.
4%. Why? Simply because India had been governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. In fact, Britain's Industrial Revolution was actually premised upon the deindustrialization of India. The handloom weavers, for example, famed across the world, whose products were exported around the world, Britain came right in. There were actually these weavers making fine muslin, light as woven air, it was said. And Britain came right in, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw materials from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being a world-famous exporter of finished cloth into an importer. By the end of the 19th century, the fact is that India was already Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. We literally paid for our own oppression. And as has been pointed out, the wealthy Victorian British families that made their money out of the slave economy. The most famous example, of course, was the Great Bengal Famine during the Second World War, when 4 million people died because Winston Churchill, deliberately as a matter of written minuted policy, proceeded to divert essential supplies from civilians in Bengal to sturdy Tommies and Europeans as reserve stockpiles. He said that the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis mattered much less than that of sturdy Greeks. This is Churchill's actual quote. And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to him, pointing out that people were dying because of this decision, he peevishly wrote in the margins of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" So all notions that the British were trying to do their colonial enterprise out of enlightened despotism, to try and bring the benefits of colonialism and civilization to the benighted heathen. I'm sorry, Churchill's conduct in 43 simply one example of many that gave a lie to this myth. As others have said on the proposition, violence and racism were the reality of the colonial experience. And no wonder that the sun never set on the British Empire, because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark.